my name is Emma, and I've been one of the workstream leads for the SARCs project. And our work in relation to SARCs has been slightly different. It's been really looking at the way in which SARCs work within the sector, their staff, their training, and kind of inward-onward referral routes. But today we're really just going to talk to you about a small part of the data that we drew out from that whole body of research around integration. So the integration of SARCs within this community response to sexual violence and abuse. So I'm going to take the first half of the presentation, and then Gillian is going to wrap up with looking at SARCs services, integration beyond SARCs, and also some of our recommendations. So we obviously heard from Kate earlier in talking about this particular strategy. And really this strategy does recognise that the experiences of survivors when kind of negotiating their way through services can be, that their pathway, their care pathway can be quite fragmented. And it also recognises that services can be really difficult to navigate. So what this strategy really does recognise is that importance of the need for a joined up approach, for them really to be a kind of seamless journey for survivors through services. And we can achieve that through things like commissioning and service provision. So this strategy does focus on SARC provision, but it really does move beyond that. It's looking about services beyond that SARC provision and recognising that survivors' journeys they can be simple, but they're rarely linear, and the individual needs really do vary over time, and services have got to respond to that, and the availability of those services has got to really take account of those things. And the NHS England SARC specification, so SARC specification 30, if you want to be specific, also really recognises the importance of an integrated care pathway for survivors. But that also highlights some of the complexity around commissioning services. So how SARCs sit within this community response to survivors is actually extremely complex, and coming into this research was not something we realised, and we had quite a journey at the beginning in trying to understand the complexity of models around SARCs. So there's a number of different responsibilities around commissioning across NHS, across police and crime commissioners, and that really feeds into the way in which services are set up and delivered locally. So whilst we might think of SARCs as one entity, they have providers who can be sourced from the private sector, the third sector, the NHS, the police. And whilst this SARC specification really identifies and lays out kind of standard crisis care and forensic medicals, what every SARC will provide, a SARC in the community can actually look very different. They can have is-for-care integrated within their service, they can offer short counselling services. So there isn't really a kind of one SARC out there, they vary quite considerably. So both of these publications are really important in recognising that SARCs shouldn't stand alone in this response to survivors, but also recognises that there are quite some significant complexities to achieving that. So in terms of the data that we're drawing on, this is obviously the data that we gathered for the whole of the work stream, and in terms of the people that we wanted to speak to, we really wanted to get a kind of 360-degree view of both the inward referral agencies who work with SARCs, so we're thinking about police, we're thinking about social work, we're thinking about GPs. And then within the SARC themselves, we wanted to talk to all the different types of members of staff that sat within those SARCs. And then we also wanted to talk to people who were that onward referral pathway. So people like third sector, so people like sexual health. So when we're talking today, we're drawing on 78 interviews with professionals, 296 survivors extracts, and also 5 in-depth interviews with survivors. They're broadly clustered around the 8 SARC sites, but we also did the data collection, the larger data collection that we've been talking about earlier in relation to survivors. But just to give you a sense of our sample, we've got quite a range within that sample of professionals. So in terms of seniority, so senior police officers, commissioners, and then within roles themselves, we've got quite a diversity of what those different roles look like. So within SARCs, the crisis workers, we've got representatives of daytime workers, those who work out of hours or on zero contracts, those who might be child specialists, those who might be adult specialists. So we think we've got quite a nice range within our sample, but we do have gaps, and I think it's important to recognise that in our work. So particularly GPs were hard to recruit, social workers were hard to recruit, and also in that onward referral arena in sexual health. So we don't hear their voices quite so well within this data. So in terms of awareness of SARC services, this is quite interesting because I think it aligns really well with what Kate talked about earlier in terms of awareness campaigns. And in terms of SARC being this kind of early point of contact for survivors, there still are some challenges around the awareness of SARCs existing out in our community. There's a kind of this broad general lack of awareness of SARCs. Prior to this kind of research, if I have a conversation with my friends and say I'm doing some research in SARCs, I quite often get quite a blank look and what's a SARC? And that speaks to how there is this lack of awareness in our broader society around SARCs. But specifically, this is obviously really key for survivors, not knowing that these services are out there and available for them. And that's particularly important for survivors who choose not to report to the police. What our data showed was that there's really quite clear routes. If someone chooses to report their victimisation to the police, there's quite a clear laid out route from police to that person being put in contact or being taken to use SARC services. But we know, and pretty much all of you will know in the room, that the majority of survivors do not choose to report to the police. And what that means then is that those inward referral routes and those other routes into SARCs become increasingly more important. So things like GPs, so things like social workers, so things like community mental health teams knowing about SARC services becomes increasingly more important. And I've talked about survivors' lack of awareness of services, but we also really uncovered quite a lot of professionals' lack of awareness around SARC services. So we really need to kind of develop more awareness in this area around what services are available out there more generally in terms of SARC services being part of that, in terms of what the care and what services SARCs themselves can offer, and also that kind of inward referral route. When can you refer someone into a SARC? When is it right and possible to be able to recruit them into those services? In terms of working with survivors, so this is kind of really an area which we were talking around integration within the SARC. So survivors' experiences of kind of the SARC itself, as you've seen already today, has been incredibly positive. And you can see here from the quote from Katie that they kind of felt very cared for by the staff within the SARC themselves. So they comment broadly within our survivor data around both the services they receive, but they really focus on the staff that they met there. And this is usually a crisis worker or the forensic medical worker or the forensic medical worker, forensic nurse examiner or forensic medical examiner. Bear with me one moment, I've just lost my place in my slides. And I just need to find it again so that I have my notes in front of me. Right, there we go. So this really highlighted that the care that they receive within the SARCs is very client-centred approach. It's very focused on them in terms of the care that they receive. And it focuses on enabling those survivors to make choices about what happens to them, about feeling cared for, about feeling believed, and also not feeling rushed when they access those SARC services. So there's lots of positive comments around the staff. If there is negative comments, it tends to focus on the forensic medical examiner, the forensic nurse examiner, and the kind of their clinical manner not coming across very well to the survivor. However, in thinking about this collaboration, what we're asking for is in terms of how important it is that the forensic nurse examiner, the forensic medical examiner, and those crisis workers work together really well. And you can see in this first quote on the slide how emphasised that is by the staff themselves. They see it as very important, that close-knit team, that there's a really cohesive working within that team. But in working together, there is complexity, and that kind of speaks around the commissioning of services in this area. So things like the medical examiner is usually employed by one organisation. That might mean that they're full-time within the SARC. That might be actually that they are on call and called in as and when they're needed. And the crisis worker themselves is very likely to be employed on a separate contract. If this is during the daytime, they might have contracted hours. If it's out of hours, they could be on a 0 hours contract so that they work as and when they're able. So we've got these kind of different organisations all trying to work within one service. And that creates challenges in terms of that collaboration. And I know this quote on this slide is really long, but it speaks to how difficult it can be when you don't have those cohesive working relationships in building that cohesive, close-knit team and working with each other. If you've got a medical examiner that is only infrequently using that service, they may not know the way in which their SARC works. They don't build up that way of working with a crisis worker that means that care can be quite seamless and quite joined up. And also you can see in this second quote here around where that teamwork, that sense of team between the crisis worker and the forensic nurse or forensic medical examiner don't really work. It's that kind of disparate, this person's responsible for this work job, this person's responsible for this job, and that's not necessarily delivering that client-centred, seamless care that we see, but when it does work, that we see more frequently within SARCs. Okay, I'm just going to hand over to Julie.
Right, my name is Gillian Finch and I'm from the third sector. I am also somebody who's on the lived experience group. I have never accessed a SARC. They weren't around when I needed them, and it's magical that they are here and that we're actually doing work to improve the services, but not undermine what they're doing because they are still doing amazing work. So, let's think about integration beyond the SARC. Well, we can see evidence of the complexity when the survivors move beyond the SARC, beyond the boundary of that SARC, where the organisations themselves state a strong wish to be working together and for the responses to be joined up. However, as noted by the specific crisis worker, this doesn't always work in practice, and this can be reflected in the care received by survivors. So I think it's that thing about wanting everybody to work together, but sometimes because of the way that organisations are disparate and funded, it might mean that actually that is quite fragmented, and that's one of the issues that's been highlighted. What was a very common experience after accessing a SARC is the amount of organisations that can be involved in supporting an individual, depending on whether that person has said yes or no to a specific service. Remembering that this response, the yes or no, is often when they are in a state of emotional crisis. From that point forward, it can be incredibly intricate based on the care pathway for that area. So survivors can find navigating their way through this to be a challenge, especially feeling traumatised, as most will be. You can see from the two quotes on this slide about the experiences of these individuals and the impacts, such as having to repeat aspects of their experience of rape, sexual assault or sexual abuse. And we can see what happens in the third quote when the relationships between the organisations fail or are not sufficiently robust, and that survivors' thoughts then fall through the gaps between specific organisations and the continuity of care stops or at least is interrupted. These gaps in care could be explained by some of the known challenges around information sharing between organisations. In explaining how ongoing care could be interrupted, and there's many and varied reasons, but it may, one area, be through the difficulties of information sharing. This is exasperated by the multitude of organisations involved in the referral pathways, but the key challenges to seamless care pathways is the variety of non-interfaced IT systems used across different organisations across different sectors. This is a major barrier to information sharing, and in such instances, referrals have to be made manually through online submission sites or through secure email systems and via the phone. That increases the workloads of staff in sharing information to the relevant organisation, as there may be a number of referrals needed depending on the complexity of that individual survivor's needs. The idiosyncrasies of some referral processes, as can be seen in the quote, also frustrates staff. And this chasing work, described by one participant as their nagging work, was talked about by many staff, about the need to information check between partner organisations, such as between the SARC, the third sector, about following up referrals to make sure a referral has been received, about checking whether appointments have been scheduled with the right person, for example in a sexual health clinic, so that they understand the appointment is with a client who's experienced sexual crime. All of this work is being carried out by crisis workers, by ISFAs, at a time when their workloads are already substantial in supporting survivors who have been, and continue to be, traumatised. It is clear that when and if an error occurs, that has a direct impact on the client in interrupting, delaying, or stopping them receiving the care that they need. Survivors need to be able to make informed and empowered choices, and that's been very much the key message today, about their crisis care and thereafter. And that means knowing options for access pathways. SARCs need to be more visible, and we've talked about that, and identifiable as a care option for those in crisis, particularly if the event they've experienced is recent. Many survivors are totally unaware of the existence of SARC services. Similarly worrying is that professionals and others who come into day-to-day contact with survivors, like GPs and others, are similarly lacking this important information. Notwithstanding the increased numbers now accessing SARCs post-COVID lockdowns, the lack of SARC awareness still means that many are still missing this crisis care route, and ongoing emotional and physical care is further compromised. The research outcomes are clear in that what is needed is a considerable and sustained effort, well beyond that of individual SARCs, to raise public and professional awareness about existing services. And that's why it was really helpful to hear from Kate Davis from NHS England about the work that's already happening. Despite the complexity of how different organisations and services are contracted, research has clearly highlighted how professionals within the SARC are working together effectively to provide a cohesive service. We saw examples of how SARC managers have brought together different aspects of their service to have a shared vision of providing trauma-informed care. Other examples include the way in which forensic staff are employed, with an outcome that the relationship between them and the crisis team members have been strengthened. Sharing good practice is a key outcome of our research, in that such improvements benefit not only survivors accessing specialist services, but also on the workforce delivering frontline and from a commissioning perspective. In moving beyond the SARC service boundary, we are likely to be able to simplify the varied landscape of statutory and non-statutory organisations that are then available and how they are accessed by individual survivors. But we can and should think carefully about how we can make it easier to work between the different organisations. Overwhelming the professionals that we've spoken to recognise the importance of this and getting it right for their clients, but they are hampered by a range of IT issues. We focus on information sharing today and how that can affect care, whilst also having a secondary impact of substantially increasing the workloads of those involved in delivering such care, within the SARC or elsewhere within the care pathway. Whilst it might appear to be an easy answer, in reality it's complex and requires not only financial investment but also an understanding and appreciation of the ways in which the different organisations work. The main reason that survivors choose to access the third sector is that based on the premise of confidentiality. This factor cannot be and should not be ignored and needs to be safeguarded within any approach to improve information sharing. In summary, there is no easy answer to information sharing. There is not one size fits all, however much we might wish it to be so. But we do need to explore how we can facilitate IT interfaces between organisations that will facilitate the communication of information. The key focus is on understanding survivor pathways and seeking to remove barriers and challenges, such as overly difficult referral routes that interrupt or slow down care, whilst not at the same time oversharing information about individuals who have not sought signposting or referrals. This must always be the difficult equation of how to help without the potential to do more harm. Thank you for listening.